In the shadowed annals of forgotten estates, where the weight of inherited dominion presses upon the earth like an unrelenting fog, there lies the account of the Valerian lineage, whose end came not with thunderous upheaval, but through the quiet erosion of their own essence. Picture, if you will, the vast halls of a crumbling manor in the mist-shrouded hills of 18th-century Prussia, where the air itself seemed to conspire against breath, heavy with the dampness of perpetual twilight. Here, the family of Baron Elias Valerian held court over lands that stretched into obscurity, their authority a brittle scaffold built upon the bent spines of those bound to till the soil and tend the fires. The baron's gaze, ever vigilant, surveyed not just fields but the very souls laboring beneath his decree, reducing human, striving to mere echoes in the void of his indifference. Consider the inexorable grind of existence under such a yoke, where each dawn unfolds not as renewal, but as a deeper inscription of futility. The serfs, nameless in the ledgers of power, move through their days like specters in a dream they could not awaken from, their labors feeding a machine that devoured without satiation. Among them was Leora, a woman whose hands had long ago learned the secrets of the wild growths that bordered the estate, roots that burrowed deep into poisoned soil, leaves that whispered of hidden potencies. She was no mere tiller. Her role was to forage and prepare the infusions that sustained the household through harsh winters, her knowledge a fragile thread connecting life to the indifferent earth. Yet this knowledge, born of necessity, carried within it the seeds of dissolution, for what nurtures can also unravel, thread by thread, the fabric of being. Ponder the philosophical chasm that yawns between master and servant, where one claims dominion over the other's very breath, ignorant that such claims invite the abyss to stare back. The baron's family, ensconced in their illusions of permanence, dined upon the fruits of subjugation, their conversations laced with the hollow ring of entitlement, discussing harvests as if they were divine gifts rather than the extracted toll of human exhaustion. Elias, with his stern countenance etched by years of unchallenged command, enforced obedience not through overt violence alone, but through the subtle art of deprivation. Rations withheld, families separated, hopes extinguished like embers under boot. His wife, Isolde, floated through the manor like a faded apparition, her elegance a mask for the emptiness that gnawed at her core, her days filled with the rote performance of nobility that concealed a growing disquiet, a sense that the foundations of their world trembled beneath unseen pressures. The children, 3 in number, Adrian the heir, with his burgeoning arrogance mirroring his father's, Clara, whose youthful curiosity had soured into quiet resentment, and young Theo, whose innocence was already fracturing under the weight of expected cruelty, grew in this atmosphere of suppressed vitality, learning to view the serfs as extensions of the land itself, devoid of inner life. Extended kin dwelled within the manor's walls as well. Elias's brother, Victor, overseer of the granaries, whose ledger-bound existence hid a simmering envy, his spouse, Helena, who orchestrated gatherings to affirm their status, and the dowager aunt, Margaret, whose wizened form belied a mind sharp with the calculations of survival in a hierarchy that spared no one. Together, they formed a constellation of privilege, orbiting the baron's will, blind to the gravitational pull of resentment accumulating in the shadows. Delve deeper into the psychological labyrinth that ensnares those stripped of agency, where the mind, denied outward expression, turns inward, forging weapons from the debris of daily torment. Leora's days blurred into a monotonous ritual of gathering, brewing, and serving, her hands calloused not just from thorns but from the invisible barbs of constant diminishment. She had once harbored fragments of joy, whispers shared with fellow laborers under moonless skies, the fleeting warmth of kinship amid the cold expanse. But as seasons cycled without mercy, these fragments eroded, leaving a hollow core where purpose had dwelt. Her bond with Merrick, a fellow serf tasked with the forges, offered brief respite, their stolen moments a fragile rebellion against the void. Yet even this was tainted, for the baron's edicts intruded, demanding Marek's labor extend into endless nights, his body breaking under loads that served only to bolster the manor's facade. Reflect upon the existential dread that permeates such imbalances, where power's illusion fosters a false security, while the oppressed confront the raw indifference of the universe daily. The Baron's household routines unfolded with mechanical inevitability. Mornings devoted to inspections that humiliated and afternoons to feasts that mocked the starving. Winter gatherings, held in the grand hall amid flickering hearths, celebrated the family's endurance, toasts raised to prosperity born of others' despair. Leora, ever present in the periphery, observed these rituals with eyes that gradually shifted from resignation to analytical detachment, noting the Baron's preference for bitter tonics to ward off ailments, Isolde's reliance on soothing draughts for her unrest, the children's unwitting consumption of fortified milks. Her foragings, once benign, evolved into deliberate quests, seeking flora whose essences could mimic nature's caprice, substances that, in measured accumulations, blurred the line between sustenance and sabotage. Contemplate the spiraling descent into moral ambiguity, where vengeance becomes not an act of passion but a philosophical imperative, a reassertion of existence against erasure. As frost gripped the land, tensions within the manor intensified. Poor yield strained resources, prompting Elias to impose harsher quotas, his temper a storm that scattered fear like leaves in wind. Marek, pushed beyond endurance, faltered in his duties, drawing the Baron's ire, a public reprimand that escalated into confinement, his form left to weaken in the chill of unused cellars. Leora, witnessing this from afar, felt a fracture within, her affection transmuted into a cold resolve, the pressure of accumulated injustices compressing her spirit into diamond-hard focus. She began to weave her observations into a tapestry of intent, each family member's vulnerabilities catalogued. Victor's weakened constitution from years of excess, Helena's sensitivity to certain bitters, Margaret's dependence on nightly elixirs. Examine the dread that arises from the realization that human connections are but illusions, fragile against the tide of systemic decay. Leora's transformation was gradual, her outward demeanor a veil of compliance, while inwardly she navigated the ethics of retaliation, not as justice, but as an inevitable response to the void's call. She consulted, in hushed tones, with elder foragers whose lore spanned generations, learning of compounds that induced languor masquerading as seasonal malaise, essences that disrupted the body's rhythms without immediate alarm. These exchanges, conducted in the forest gloom, revealed the dual nature of the natural world, provider and destroyer, mirroring the human capacity for both creation and annihilation. Her experiments, subtle and spread over moons, tested tolerances, slight alterations in communal brews that elicited mild complaints dismissed as winter's toll. Ponder the oppressive weight of isolation in pursuit of such ends, where the Avenger becomes untethered from shared humanity, drifting into a solitary orbit of purpose. Leora's interactions with her kin grew distant. Marek's pleas for moderation fell upon ears attuned only to the rhythm of impending unraveling. "This path leads to our mutual ruin," he urged in shadowed meetings, but she responded with a serenity born of transcendence, her gaze reflecting the abyss she had embraced. The other serfs sensed the shift, their camaraderie fracturing as her presence evoked unease, a reminder of the precipice they all teetered upon. Yet she persisted, her preparations culminating in the grand winter solstice rite, a feast decreed by Elias to affirm dominance over nature's harshness, inviting local nobles whose alliances buttressed his rule. Delve into the philosophical undercurrents of such gatherings, where opulence serves as a bulwark against the encroaching nothing, yet invites its infiltration. The manor thrummed with activity, halls adorned with evergreens that masked the scent of decay, tables laden with viands infused by Leora's hand. Guests arrived amid snowfall, their carriages carving paths through white desolation. counts and landowners whose conversations echoed the barons, reinforcing the delusion of invulnerability. Leora, orchestrating the infusions and stews, executed her design with ritualistic calm, distributing essences calibrated to build symphonically, symptoms emerging as a chorus of subtle disharmonies. Fatigue mistaken for revelry's aftermath, unease attributed to the cold. Consider the existential horror of bodies betraying minds, the slow realization that control is ephemeral, dissolving into chaos. As the night deepened, the hall's warmth turned stifling, laughter giving way to discomfort. Elias clutched his chalice tighter, his commands slurring into confusion. Isolde's poise crumbled into tremors. The children wilted like frost-bitten blooms. Victor gasped for air that seemed thickened. Helena's vision swam. Margaret's whispers turned to wheezes. The physician among the guests, her Conrad, rose in alarm, his diagnostics faltering against the multifaceted assault, organs faltering in concert, as if the very essence of life recoiled from its vessels. Reflect upon the dread of witnessing one's construct unravel, the family and guests collapsing into a tableau of agony, their hierarchies meaningless against biological betrayal. Screams mingled with the crackle of fires, bodies contorting in futile resistance, the manor's grandeur mocking their downfall. Leora, stationed in the antechamber, absorbed the cacophony with impassive tears, her act a culmination not of triumph, but of necessary obliteration, the pressure of existence demanding balance through destruction. Examine the aftermath's lingering shadow, where survival offers no solace, only deeper immersion in the void. Conrad, spared perhaps by moderation or chance, documented the calamity as epidemic, his journals hinting at deliberate artistry, yet conceding the impossibility of proof. The estate, bereft of its core, fragmented under legal dissections, serfs dispersed like ash and wind, Merrick vanishing into distant labors, his spirit extinguished by grief. Leora faded from records, whispers suggesting flight into wilderness or absorption into anonymity. Her legacy a spectral unease haunting the grounds. Unexplained maladies at gatherings, apparitions in fog, the persistent sense of watchful presence. Ponder the inexorable cycle wherein oppression begets its mirror, souls warped into instruments of the same indifference they endured. The Valerians, ensnared in their era's norms, embodied the fallacy of separation from consequence, their demise a testament to the interconnected fragility of all being. Yet this revelation brings no catharsis, only the heavy certainty that such spirals persist, embedding dread in the fabric of human endeavor, unresolved, echoing into the endless night, in the dim corridors of a forgotten estate in the Carpathian foothills, where winter never fully relents and summer arrives only as a rumor. The House of Dragon once stood as a monument to continuity that no longer believed in itself. The manor had been built stone by stone over generations, each addition a quiet assertion that something could endure. Yet by the final decade of the 19th century, the structure had begun to behave as though it understood its own obsolescence. Cracks appearing overnight in walls that had stood for centuries, floors settling with sighs that carried no wind, windows fogging from the inside as though the house itself were breathing out its last warmth. The family that occupied it, 7 adults and 4 children, moved through those rooms with the careful tread of people who sense they are trespassing on borrowed time. Baroness Ekaterina Dragan presided over the household with a composure so absolute it bordered on absence. Her husband, Radu, spent his days in a library among books whose pages he no longer turned, staring instead at the spines as though they might eventually confess why meaning had withdrawn from the world. Their eldest son, Stefan, already carried the expression of a man who has outlived his own future. The younger siblings, 2 daughters and a boy still too small to understand hierarchy, watched their parents with the wary attentiveness of creatures that know predators can also be prey. 2 unmarried aunts, Sophia and Ileana, completed the immediate circle. Sophia embroidered scenes no one would ever see finished. Ileana cataloged the family silver as though inventorying the last possessions of a ship already sunk. A distant cousin, Mircea, had arrived years earlier for a season and remained, his presence tolerated because no one possessed the energy required to expel him. Together, they formed a tableau of inherited roles performed long after the audience had departed. Beneath them, in the lower levels and outbuildings, lived those whose labor kept the manor from collapsing entirely into metaphor. Among them moved Anka, keeper of the still room and garden. She had been born in one of the estate's outlying hamlets, raised on stories of plants that remember, who flourish where blood has soaked the soil, who wither when oaths are broken. Her work consisted of drying roots, distilling essences, preparing the infusions and poultices that maintained the fragile health of the household through the long months when physicians refused to travel the snow-blocked roads. She performed these tasks with a steadiness that others mistook for devotion. Anka understood something the family never quite articulated even to themselves, that care and harm are not opposites, but adjacent frequencies on the same scale. A root that quiets a racing heart in teaspoon doses will silence it forever in spoonfuls. A leaf that cools fever can, under different measure and intent, kindle one that no water will extinguish. She had learned these dualities not from malice, but from proximity to necessity. The same soil that fed turnips also accepted bodies when winter claimed more than it returned. For years she had existed in parallel to the family, present enough to serve, distant enough to remain unthinkable. Then came the winter when Radu, increasingly erratic, began to ration firewood for the lower quarters while insisting the great hearths upstairs burn day and night. When Anka's youngest brother, crippled from a fall in the timber yard, was denied broth because the stores were low, something inside her did not break so much as recalibrate. It was not rage that replaced resignation. It was recognition. The household had always been a single organism pretending to be many separate parts. Now she saw clearly which organs fed which, and how delicately that circulation could be interrupted. She did not decide in a single moment. Decisions of such gravity arrive gradually, like frost forming on window panes, one crystalline lattice at a time, until the view is obscured entirely. She began to adjust infusions with infinitesimal care. A few more drops of a certain Valerian cousin for Ekaterina's evening tisane, enough to deepen sleep into something heavier. A slight increase in the concentration of foxglove essence for Radu's morning draft, just sufficient to make his pulse wander. For Stefan, who preferred his wine mulled with cinnamon and clove, a thread of dried datura leaf woven into the spice sachet, small enough that its bitterness vanished beneath sweetness. Each alteration was so modest it passed for seasonal variation. Ekaterina slept longer and woke more slowly. Radu's temper, once volcanic, became a sluggish smolder. Stefan complained of dreams in which he walked through rooms that grew larger the longer he remained inside them. The ants grew forgetful. Mircea's hands trembled when he lifted a cup. The children tired more easily, their laughter thinner. No single change alarmed anyone. Change disguised as continuity is the oldest camouflage. Months passed in this manner, slow poison administered as solicitude. Anka continued her duties with the same quiet competence, mending, measuring, stirring. She listened to the household the way a musician listens to silence between notes. She noted when Ekaterina began to mistake faces in mirrors, when Radu stopped correcting the clocks, when the children no longer ran but drifted. She recorded nothing. Memory was ledger enough. One December evening, with snow falling so thickly it seemed the sky itself had wearied of holding separate flakes, the family gathered for the solstice supper, an observance more habit than belief. The table was laid in the long dining hall, where portraits of ancestors regarded the living with the mild disapproval of those who have already finished dying. Courses arrived in procession. Beet borscht thickened with sour cream, carp poached in white wine, braised cabbage laced with caraway, dumplings filled with mushroom and chestnut, poppy seed rolls still warm from the oven, and finally the traditional plum dumplings dusted with sugar that looked like fallen stars. Each dish carried its quiet signature. Anka had spent weeks preparing, not merely cooking, but composing. The beet soup held a whisper of hemlock root, so finely minced it dissolved into the crimson. The carp swam in a broth subtly laced with yew. The cabbage received an extra handful of dried henbane. The dumplings enclosed stones of aconite no larger than grains of rice. The poppy rolls were innocent. She wanted someone to survive long enough to carry the memory. They ate as families eat when ritual has outlived reason, slowly, methodically, commenting on flavors with the automatic politeness of people who no longer taste very much. Ekaterina complimented the soup's depth. Radu nodded at the fish. Stefan remarked that the cabbage seemed especially tender. The aunt smiled vaguely. Mircea drank more wine than usual. The children ate whatever was placed before them, too young to question ceremony. After the last plate was cleared, they retired to the drawing room where a fire burned unnecessarily high. Conversation faltered. One by one, they grew still. Not dramatically, not with theatrical clutching of throats, but with the slow subsidence of machines whose fuel has run dry. Ekaterina closed her eyes first, as though merely resting after a long day. Radu followed, head tipped against the high back of his chair. Stefan stared at the ceiling until his gaze lost focus. The aunts sat side by side, hands folded until their breathing synchronized and then ceased. Mircea slumped forward, glass slipping from his fingers to shatter against the hearth. The children curled into the rug like animals seeking warmth that had already departed. Anka stood in the doorway and watched. She did not move closer. There was nothing left to adjust. When morning came, the snow had stopped. Light entered the windows pale and without heat. The household remained exactly as she had left it. Upright in chairs, curled on the floor, faces composed in an expression that might have been peace if one did not look too long. She walked through the manor room by room, extinguishing candles that had burned to stubs, closing doors that had stood open, drawing curtains against the indifferent day. Then she left. No record exists of where she went. Some said south, toward the Black Sea. Others claimed she vanished into the high pastures where wolves still remember human voices. The manor stood empty for 3 winters before bailiffs arrived to inventory what remained. They found the dining table still set, food long rotted to black lace, silver tarnished but undisturbed. The portraits had not changed expression. The clocks had all stopped at 20 minutes past 10. Locals avoided the road that passed the gates. Travelers reported smelling cooked plums on nights when no kitchens were lit. Children dared each other to touch the iron fence, claiming that anyone who did would feel their pulse slow to match the silence inside. Over decades, the house acquired the reputation of a place that waits, patient, unhurried, for someone else to sit at its table and partake of what it has so carefully preserved. Nothing returned to normal. Nothing was explained. The sequence simply ended, leaving behind the faint afterimage of a supper that concluded exactly as it was meant to. Everyone present, no one leaving. The meal finished in perfect, irreversible quiet in the hollowed vaults of an abandoned seminary perched on the crags of the Scottish Highlands, where fog clings to stone like regret to memory. The Order of St. Edmund once sought to impose structure upon the chaos of human frailty. By the waning years of the 17th century, the building had devolved into a private retreat for the Carmichael clan, who had purchased it not for piety, but for seclusion, transforming chapels into chambers and altars into hearths. The air within carried the perpetual chill of unabsolved sins, drafts whispering through corridors as if the walls themselves were confessing failures long buried. Here, the family enacted their daily liturgy of endurance, unaware that sanctity and sacrilege share the same shadowed root. Envision the inexhaustible burden of legacy, where bloodlines are not gifts but chains, each link forged in the indifference of time. Laird Alistair Carmichael ruled with the solemnity of a man who mistakes rigidity for strength, his decrees echoing off vaulted ceilings like forgotten hymns. His consort, Moira, navigated the seminary's labyrinth with a grace eroded by years of silent concessions, her eyes reflecting the dim light of stained glass that depicted saints whose miracles had never manifested. Their progeny: eldest son Duncan, whose ambitions curdled into bitterness; daughter Fiona, trapped in the stasis of expected docility; and the youngest, Callum, whose curiosity was systematically extinguished, grew amid relics of faith they neither understood nor revered. Flanking them were Alastair's sister, Ailey, a widow whose mourning had petrified into perpetual vigilance; her son, Neil, who served as steward with mechanical obedience; and the aged uncle, Hamish, whose ramblings about divine retribution were dismissed as the wanderings of senescence. This assembly performed the rituals of kinship with the precision of vespers, meals taken in the refectory, where echoes amplified the hollowness of their discourse. Beneath these observances labored the attendants, shadows and habits of servitude, their existences reduced to the maintenance of illusions. Foremost among them was Sorka, custodian of the apothecary, where shelves groaned under vials of tinctures distilled from the moorland's reluctant bounty. Born in the glen below, she had ascended to this role through necessity, her hands versed in the ambiguities of botanicals that could mend or unmake. Herbs gathered under moonless skies, roots pried from earth that remembered plagues. These were her sacraments, administered with a reverence the family had long forsaken. Meditate upon the psychic corrosion that accompanies subjugation, where the self dissolves into the service of others, leaving only a residue of unspoken indictments. Sorka's routine was a litany of concessions: dawn infusions for Alastair's gout, midday balms for Moira's migraines, evening draught for the children's restive slumbers. She observed their frailties with the detachment of a confessor, noting how Duncan's vigor masked a deepening lethargy, how Fiona's pallor hinted at inner depletion, how Callum's questions faded into silence. Her own kin, brother Lachlan, who tended the grounds with stooped resignation, offered fleeting communion, their exchanges in the herb garden a fragile counterpoint to the seminary's isolation. Yet even this bond frayed under Alastair's edicts, which demanded ever more from those who had least to give. Contemplate the philosophical void that opens when authority assumes permanence, blind to the entropy that undermines all constructs. As harvests failed and debts mounted, Alastair's temper manifested as arbitrary penances. Rations curtailed, labors extended into the gloaming. When Lachlan, exhausted from tilling barren soil, collapsed during a storm, Alastair denied him respite, proclaiming idleness a sin against the household's divine order. Sorka, tending her brother's fever in the dim servants' quarters, felt the weight of this indifference settle like sediment in her veins. It was not vengeance that stirred then, but a profound acknowledgement. The family's sanctity was a facade, sustained by the very lives it eroded. She began to perceive their dependencies not as duties, but as vulnerabilities, points where the organism could be subtly, irrevocably disrupted. The transformation unfolded with the subtlety of twilight encroaching upon day, each adjustment to her preparations a minor heresy. For Alastair's tonic, a fraction more belladonna to dull his senses imperceptibly. Moira's balm received an infusion of mandrake, enough to deepen her weariness into something inexorable. Duncan's ale was laced with traces of ergot, fostering headaches he attributed to the Highland mists. Ailey's nightly posset incorporated wolfsbane in doses that accumulated like unspoken grievances. Neil's meals carried hints of Jimson wheat, blurring his stewardship into confusion. Hamish's ramblings grew more coherent, then ominously silent, under the influence of henbane. The children, innocent vessels, received the lightest touches, poppy essences that extended their sleep into realms from which waking grew laborious. These modifications were cloaked in the guise of care, symptoms dismissed as the seminary's inherent malaise. The damp stone, the relentless wind, the weight of history. Alastair consulted faded grimoires in vain. Moira prayed before icons that offered no response. Duncan paced the cloisters, his frustration mounting without direction. Fiona withdrew into embroidery that depicted increasingly barren landscapes. Callum's playthings lay abandoned, his energy sapped by an unseen tide. Ailey and Neil conferred in whispers, their suspicions diffused by growing disorientation. Hamish stared at the rafters, as if discerning patterns in the cobwebs that mirrored the family's unraveling. Ponder the dread inherent in gradual dissolution, where the familiar becomes alien and agency slips away like sand through fingers. Sorka's consultations with Glen elders, veiled as quests for rarer herbs, yielded deeper lore. Combinations that mimicked agues, essences that disrupted the humors without trace. She tested these in isolation, observing effects on stray creatures, calibrating with the precision of a horologist adjusting gears. Her interactions with Lachlan grew strained. He sensed a shift in her demeanor, a calm that bordered on transcendence. "This will consume you as surely as them," he warned in the Urgarden's dusk. But Sorka's response carried the finality of a tolling bell. "Consumption is the nature of all things. I merely direct its course." As equinox approached, the seminary's atmosphere thickened with unspoken portents. Candles guttering without breeze, shadows lingering where light should prevail. Alastair decreed a grand vesper feast to reaffirm their dominion, inviting neighboring lairds whose alliances masked rivalries. The refectory was prepared with faded splendor, linens yellowed by time, chalices dulled by disuse. Sorka orchestrated the repast with ritualistic deliberation. Broths simmered from more roots, breads kneaded with fortified flours, meats roasted over fires fed by aromatic woods, puddings steeped in cordials. Each element bore her invisible imprimatur. The broth a symphony of nightshade variances, the bread embedded with fungal spores, the meats marinated in toxic reductions, the puddings crowned with berries whose sweetness concealed finality. The gathering commenced under leaden skies, toasts raised to endurance amid tempests. Alastair expounded on legacy. Moira nodded with waning attentiveness. Duncan challenged guests with hollow bravado. Fiona served with mechanical poise. Callum fidgeted, his vitality dimmed. Ailey and Neil attended with vigilance that faltered into vagueness. Hamish muttered invocations that trailed into silence. The lairds partook heartily, their compliments masking the subtle onset. Warmth turning to flush, satisfaction to unease. Post-repast, in the chapel-turned-salon, the assembly settled before a hearth that offered no comfort. Conversation ebbed. Alastair's voice grew hoarse. Moira's hands trembled. Duncan's gaze unfocused. Fiona slumped against a pew. Callum curled fetal. Ailey whispered unanswered queries. Neil clutched his throat. Hamish smiled as if recognizing an old acquaintance. The lairds, one by one, succumbed, convulsions subdued, breaths labored, forms stilling into poses of interrupted prayer. Sorka observed from the sacristy threshold, her presence a silent absolution. No cries pierced the quiet, only the wind's lament through fissures. Dawn revealed the tableau unchanged, bodies arrayed as in vigil, faces etched with the serenity of release denied in life. She departed as mist rose, vanishing into the moors where boundaries dissolve. The seminary stood sentinel, its stones absorbing the event like so many prior transgressions. Investigators attributed the calamity to tainted provisions, a Highland curse, divine judgment. Records faded, whispers persisted, a feast where guests never depart, of shadows that brew unseen draughts. Yet the deeper resonance lies in the inexorability of erosion, where structures of power crumble not from assault, but from the quiet persistence of what they suppress. The Carmichaels embodied the delusion of separation, their end a reminder that all hierarchies are illusions sustained by complicity. Sorka's act, born of necessity, underscores the tragedy. In reclaiming agency, one becomes the mirror of what one opposes, perpetuating the cycle into endless, unyielding dusk. In the salt-crusted cellars beneath a derelict lighthouse on the Breton coast, where the Atlantic has spent centuries gnawing at the stone like a patient animal. The Le Guin family once maintained what they called a household. By the early years of the 20th century, the tower itself had long ceased to function as a beacon. Its lamp was shattered, its lens clouded with verdigris. Yet the family persisted in the keeper's quarters below, as though the structure still held some navigational purpose. They lived inside a metaphor they no longer recognized, a light that no longer warned anyone away from anything. The household number 9. Patriarch Yves Le Guin, once a quartermaster in the merchant marine, now spent his days charting imaginary courses across yellowed maps pinned to damp walls. His wife, Anne, moved through the rooms with the slow deliberation of someone carrying an invisible weight balanced on her skull. Their children, eldest son Ronan, whose seafaring dreams had curdled into resentment, daughter Elise, silent since adolescence, and the twins, small-boned and watchful, grew up listening to the same wave crash against the same rocks every few seconds for years. 2 elderly cousins, Therese and Marcel, occupied the attic rooms, preserving the fiction that they were only visiting. A widowed sister-in-law, Claire, completed the circle, her mourning clothes faded to the color of old sea foam. They ate together every evening at a long table fashioned from salvaged ship's planking. The meals were simple, repetitive, ritualistic. Fish stew thickened with seaweed, black bread hardened by salt air, potatoes boiled until they surrendered all texture, followed by weak tisanes brewed for whatever dried plants could be gathered from the cliffs. Conversation, when it occurred, circled the same worn channels: tides, weather, the price of cod and breast, never touching the deeper currents that moved beneath their lives. Down in the lowest storerooms, among barrels of pitch and coils of fraying rope, worked Gwen, the woman who kept the household fed and breathing. She had come to the lighthouse as a girl of 14 to assist an ailing aunt. The aunt had died. The girl had stayed. Over 2 decades, she had learned the peculiar alchemy of the place, which lichens eased coughing, which seaweeds bound wounds, which roots gathered after the equinox could quiet a racing heart or slow one to stillness. Her knowledge was practical, inherited, uncelebrated. She prepared the family's food and drink with the same steady hands she used to mend nets or caulk seams. No one remarked on her competence because competence in that house was expected to be invisible. Consider the slow suffocation of lives lived in permanent proximity to an element that neither loves nor hates, only erodes. Eve had begun to drink more heavily after each unsuccessful attempt to find work ashore. Anne's migraines arrived with every new moon. Ronan's temper flared without warning and subsided just as quickly, leaving apologies no one believed. Elise spoke less each year until her silence acquired its own gravity. The twins developed a private language of glances and gestures that excluded everyone else. Therese and Marcel argued in murmurs about events that had happened 40 years earlier. Claire wept at unpredictable intervals, always alone. Gwen watched these deteriorations the way a lighthouse watches its shipping lanes, distant, constant, unblinking. She noticed when Eve began to favor his left arm, when Anne's hands shook pouring tea, when Ronan's appetite shrank, when Elise stopped eating anything that required chewing. She saw the twins grow thinner, their skin taking on the translucency of tide pools at low water. She registered Therese's persistent cough, Marcel's swollen joints, Claire's increasing pallor. None of it surprised her. The body, like the cliff, simply responds to what is done to it over time. One autumn, after a gale had torn half the roof slates away, and Eve had refused to spend money on repairs because the house has stood this long, the family's rations grew noticeably scant. Claire's portion was quietly reduced first, then Therese, then Marcel's. When Ronan protested, Eve reminded him that hierarchy at sea, and therefore at home, was not negotiable, and said nothing. The twins watched with wide, unreadable eyes. That was the season Gwen's preparations changed. She did not alter recipes so much as adjust emphases. A pinch more of the bitter rue that grew in the crevice below the high tide mark went into Eve's morning infusion. Anne's evening tisane received an extra thread of dried foxglove leaf, just enough to deepen drowsiness into something heavier. Ronan's stew acquired a subtle undertone of water hemlock root, minced so finely it dissolved into the broth. Elise's bread was brushed with an oil pressed from seeds she had gathered the previous spring. The twins' milk was warmed with a few drops of something colorless and odorless drawn from a small vial she kept locked inside a rusted tin. Therese and Marcel received their usual herbal drafts. Only now the balance had shifted toward sedation rather than relief. Claire's portions carried the lightest touch, enough to ensure she slept through whatever came next. The changes were so gradual, they passed for seasonal melancholy. Eve grew forgetful, then confused, then intermittently furious at his own confusion, and slept 14, then 16, then 18 hours a day. Ronan's rages became sluggish, his limbs heavy, his speech slurred. Elise withdrew further until she barely rose from her cot. The twins moved more slowly, their private language reduced to faint twitches of eyelid and finger. Therese's cough quieted. Marcel's complaints ceased. Claire stopped weeping altogether. On the night of the winter solstice, when a lighthouse shadow stretched longest across the rocks, Gwen prepared the final meal. She baked flatbreads studded with dried kelp and a faint dusting of ergot. She simmered a fish stew enriched with a reduction she had boiled for 3 days in a copper pot. She steeped a pot of dark tea using leaves she had dried under October's thin moon. Everything was placed on the table with the same unhurried care she had always shown. They ate in near silence. Eve chewed mechanically and stared at her spoon as though it were an unfamiliar object. Ronan swallowed without tasting. Elise took small, automatic bites. The twins mirrored each other's movements exactly. Therese and Marcel ate with the slow gratitude of people who no longer expect much. Claire sipped her tea and smiled faintly, as though remembering something pleasant from very long ago. After the meal, they did not rise. They remained seated, postures loosening degree by degree. Eve's head tipped forward until his chin rested on his chest. Anne's hands slid into her lap. Ronan slumped sideways against the table edge. Elise closed her eyes and did not open them again. The twins leaned into each other until their foreheads touched. Therese and Marcel sat upright for a surprisingly long time, then gently subsided together like books closing. Claire remained sitting longest, gazing toward the single candle flame until it guttered out and left only darkness. Gwen stood in the doorway until the last breath in the room had sighed away. Then she walked upstairs to the lantern room, opened the cracked lens housing, and looked out at the black water. She did not light the lamp. There was nothing left that needed warning. At first light, she descended to the storeroom, gathered a small canvas bag containing dried roots, a tin cup, a knife, and a vial she had kept locked away. She left through the sea door, stepping over kelp and broken shells, and walked along the Titterline until the lighthouse shrank to a gray finger against the sky. No one came looking for the family until spring, when a fishing boat noticed the missing roof and the absence of smoke. Gendarmes found the 9 bodies still seated around the table, faces composed, hands folded or resting on laps, as though waiting for a course that had never arrived. The stew pot contained only residue. The teapot was empty. Autopsies revealed nothing conclusive. Perhaps tainted fish, perhaps spoiled grain, perhaps a collective failure of the heart brought on by malnutrition and cold. The case was closed as misadventure. The lighthouse stood empty for decades. Locals avoided the path that led to it, claiming the air tasted of copper and sleep. Children dared each other to spend an hour inside the lantern room. Those who did reported hearing the scrape of chairs being pushed back, the soft clink of spoons against bowls, the long exhalation of 9 people finishing a meal at the same moment. Eventually, the structure was dynamited as a navigation hazard. The rubble was pushed into the sea, the cove filled with new kelp forests. Fishermen still report, on very still nights, a faint smell of boiled fish and roux drifting across the water when no boats are cooking. Nothing was resolved. No confession was left. The table, like the tide, simply waited for the next set of hands to sit at it, eat what was offered, and subside into the same patient silence.